Hey everyone, so I decided to take a break from the life story stuff I've been doing to talk about some other stuff, and primarily what's been on my mind a lot lately because I keep getting dragged into these arguments is the whole issue of should trans women be allowed to compete with cis women in sports, whether it be high school level, college level, or elite status like Olympics, things like that. So I thought, why not delve into it? And I will talk about it here because I'm sick of being dragged into arguments and discussions about it that it's like every time there's an article, someone tags me and wants me to talk about it. And I'm just kind of getting tired of it. So in this regard, I can record this video, post it to YouTube. Somebody says, hey, Allie, what do you think about this? I can say, well, go to my YouTube channel and I talk about it and I lay it out. And so this video may be a little bit long. We'll see how it goes. But I'm going to break it down. So let's talk about the myths that are out there, right? People like to say, oh, it's a scientific fact. It's a scientific fact that people born assigned male at birth, of course, they don't say assigned male at birth, they say born as men, but that they're going to be stronger, their bone structure is going to be thicker, and that hormones don't change that. Those are all made up. Those are opinions, okay? Rarely do I see someone arguing this point who is an expert in the field, who understands hormone replacement therapy, what it does to the body, and believe me, it does a lot. And I'll talk about me, and that's all I can talk about is me, and I'll reference a couple other individuals that I know and how they've changed. So, let's talk about college sports. So, the NCAA has guidelines, requirements for trans athletes to compete. And typically we're talking about trans women. Because trans men often, if they go over and they start competing as men rather quickly, they're going to be at a disadvantage, right? Physiologically. They're not going to have the muscle yet. That's not to say that trans men can't build the muscle. They certainly can. But they're not going to have it right away. So let's talk about the facts. So the NCAA requires for a trans woman to compete that their hormone levels be within the cis female range, both for estrogen and testosterone for at least a year. I believe the NCAA, and don't quote me on this, I know the IOC does, but I believe the NCAA also requires that the trans female athlete have also had gender confirmation surgery, bottom surgery, sexual reassignment surgery, whatever you want to call it. So let's talk about those things. So typically, a surgeon won't perform that surgery on you until you've been on hormones for at least a year and a half. That's what they like to see. So let's talk about an elite athlete. Okay, let's talk about a 20-year-old athlete or an 18-year-old athlete who wants to do this. So they've been on hormones for at least a year and a half, then they have the surgery. We're probably talking a good 6 months before they're really feeling good and starting to get back to that elite status. So when all's said and done, we're probably talking about somebody who's been on hormone replacement therapy for 2.5 to 3 years before they can compete. So when you consider that, this isn't somebody who just one day decided, hey, you know what? I'm a girl and I'm going to play with the girls. It doesn't work that way at the elite levels. I know the IOC definitely requires the surgery component. And most athletes who are competing at that level, if you are at that caliber, you don't transition because you want to win medals. You transition because that's who you are, okay? I am, and this is a mouthful, I am a queer, pansexual, intersex, binary trans woman. And all that goes with that, I didn't just one day become these things. I was. Now, my sexuality evolved, but again, gender and sexuality are two completely different things. So, when we're talking gender, there are stringent guidelines in place for the NCAA and for the IOC and other major national organizations when it comes to trans athletes competing at a high level. So we don't need to like split hairs. And more to the point, when was the last time you saw a trans athlete breaking records at those levels? There's so much that goes into it, right? So you have a lot of trans women who are between 5 feet and 5'5". So they're not of a size typically where they're going to compete at the highest levels. All right? Because most of your elite caliber athletes, female or male, tend to be on the taller sides of their gender. That's just how it is. Which stands to reason. You know, the whys to that. Not to mention there's so many things that go into athletics. If we're talking team sports, for example, a friend of mine, Athena Del Rosario, who played goalkeeper for University of California, Santa Cruz. She was a goalkeeper for the soccer team there and did not reveal her trans status until the end of her senior year, other than to the administrator who had to run her hormone tests, and nobody knew. And she points out regularly, as a huge advocate on behalf of trans athletes, that nobody knew for a reason, because she wasn't the best on the field. She wasn't on the best on the field skill-wise, and she wasn't the best on the field physically a lot of the time. So again, this idea that because you're trans, you're going to be better is ridiculous. Now, when we talk about high school athletics, that's where a lot of the arguments come into play. And that's where a lot of the problematic situations arise from, because high school sports are governed by state athletic associations. So, and in some instances, such as the state of Georgia, they allow the individual school districts and schools to self-determine if trans athletes can compete or not, and the state will back the school's play. In states like Texas, you have to compete as the gender on your birth certificate, which has run into issues with a trans boy having to compete with the girls in state wrestling tournaments, and people getting all upset about that. And it's like, look, he'd rather compete with the boys, but you're not letting him, so he has to compete with the girls. So it just goes to show how ridiculous the rule is, and that's part of the reason why he competes. He loves the sport, and he's also pointing out how ridiculous the rule is. So when we talk about girls at the high school level, many trans girls, they want to compete with other girls. They want to play with their friends. So if you're a girl and you play soccer or softball or volleyball and you have friends, you want to be on the same team with your friends. Not to mention, if you've been raised or lived as a girl for a while, or even if you haven't, a lot of times men and women approach athletics and competition a little bit differently. And I think at the elite levels, women are just as competitive as men, but sometimes the spirit with which they go at it is a little bit different. And so if gender's up here, I want to play with the girls. I don't want to play with the boys. I can remember I was still playing soccer at a fairly high level 2 or 3 years ago before my transition. And as I started to transition, I was playing with men, grown men. And the minute that I started having breast development, I didn't feel I should be playing with the boys anymore. There's a fundamental shift up in my brain. And I just didn't feel right about it. So I stopped playing with them. This is the same thing for young trans women. You know, if they're in high school and they want to compete against their gender, they don't want to compete against the opposite gender. Not to mention, there's a lot of stuff when it comes to safety that goes into play. Like, if you're going to make a trans girl compete with boys, there's all sorts of problematic reasons for that. And I get the problematic reasons when you allow a trans girl who last month started to transition and she's been running sprint events against boys and she hasn't seen the physical changes yet. I get that, but that's not the child's fault. That's the State Athletic Association or the school. And here's where I diverge in part. I can see where there's the chance that some athletes might have an advantage. I freely admit that. But where I diverge from that is they're not taking a scholarship away from somebody else, because coaches at the college level, they know. They pay attention. They pay attention to the rankings. And again, like there was an article not too long ago about a girl who said, oh, they're stealing my spot. Well, no. If you're one of the best, you're still going to be one of the best. And coaches are going to know that the trans athlete, she may see her times drop as she's on hormones longer. In fact, I can almost guarantee you she will. Whereas this girl should only get better. So will this girl stay at this level? She's going to drop. How far will she drop? Will she drop below this girl or about equal? So this girl's more the sure thing. They realize her potential more than they're going to realize the trans athlete. So this idea that cis girls are going to lose out on scholarships is garbage. All right. So talking about myself, I can tell you like what's happened to me in the last couple of years. So 2 years ago, I could I could rattle off 75 push-ups, perfect form, no problem. I was bench pressing over 300 pounds. Carrying things was very easy for me. My muscles never seemed to get tired. All those things that we hear about men and testosterone, the bonus of it, and all those things. So let's talk about me today. And I was just actually laughing about it with my best friend who I live with and who she noticed it. And today I can barely do 6 push-ups. Now granted, I haven't lifted weights over the last 2 years, but still 6 push-ups, 75 to 6, that's a dramatic decline, which is due to the change in my hormones. So I can do 6 perfect push-ups, and the last 2, my arms shake and buckle like crazy. Carrying a case of soda in, if my arm is bent, just going from my car into the house, into the kitchen, my arm starts to cramp. I deal with the same issues with my legs. So running times dramatically started to decrease. And that's just within a year, okay, or a year to 2 years. So you think about 3 years, you think about 4 years, or let's take a trans girl who goes on blockers at the age of 11, never develops with testosterone, goes on estrogen, has surgery in their teens, and then goes on to play sports in college. Her body will develop like any girl's. She will get hip width. Her arms will develop like any girl's, her rib cage. In addition, a 15, 16-year-old who decides to transition, right, your hip bones don't fuse until your mid-20s. So if you're a teenager and you go through and you transition and you go on HRT, you will get hip width. Your bone structure in your hips will change, and that's going to affect your body mechanics and all those things. So this idea that they're going to have an advantage, maybe initially, but that advantage is going to diminish. Okay, plus high school sports is ultimately, we've lost sight of this. Most students will never get a scholarship. So high school sports is about teaching sportsmanship, teaching things like perseverance and self-accomplishment. It's about fun. It's about playing with your friends. It's about making memories. And I think trans girls, trans boys should have those same opportunities as any cis kid out there. And that's really what it comes down to. So while I will admit there might be an initial advantage, that's not what high school sports is supposed to be about. I coached high school sports, both football and wrestling, for years. I have a pretty good handle on what it's about, also having been a high school athlete. And so that's what we need to keep in mind. These are kids. These aren't adults. And they're not doing it for the reasons why you may think they're doing it. So there's a lot of misinformation out there that I would urge you to be aware of. And you can always go and look at, let's say, the U.S. Soccer Association. You can go and you can see what their policy is. You can go look at U.S. Gymnastics and see what their policy is regarding trans athletes. They have comprehensive policies. So this idea that they're just, and they've had them for a while. So there you go as far as that goes. Bottom line, if you see me as a woman, then that means I should be allowed into all female spaces. Unless you see me as a woman with an asterisk, which is a whole other problematic issue that I will address later on, because I do deal with women like that. And men, obviously, but I don't want to get into that. Bottom line is, if you see these kids as the gender they are, I don't want to say the gender that they live as or the gender that they identify with, because to say that they identify with it means that they can change, that it's a change your mind situation. No, they are girls. If they are trans girls, they are girls. If they are trans guys, they are boys. It's that easy. So let the girls compete with the girls. Let the boys compete with the boys. Whatever happens, happens. Okay? Until we start seeing trans athletes on all the leaderboards everywhere, this argument does not hold any water. We don't have any world records held by trans people, and there's a good reason for that. Because at a time, especially with teenagers, where all they want to do is fit in, the last thing they want to do is draw attention to themselves. And so there are some that maybe don't compete because they're not interested in it. You have some that are, because they're athletes, and they're going to compete. And that's okay. Some things in life are more important than winning. That's ideally what we're trying to teach our kids by athletics, right? It's not all about the win. We learn more from our failures and our losses than we ever do from our victories. So, it teaches affirmation and acceptance, which is really what, as educators, I'm an educator, what educators should be about, what healthcare professionals should be about, and what parents should be about. So that's kind of my take on it, and I'm really not going to talk about it anymore online. This is it, unless there's something new that comes about. I'm done talking about this issue. So thanks for taking this wild ride with me, and I hope you all have a great night. Bye.